So thank you very much, Professor Helmut Tauscher, to agree to this interview for the Oral History of Tibetan Studies project at Oxford. And if I can, I would like to start asking about your family background, how you were growing up, maybe where and when were you born, or what are your memories of childhood?
Well, I was born in Vienna, but very soon we moved to Tyrol, where I grew up. So I consider myself Tyrolean. Still, after 40 years, more than 40 years living in Vienna now, I still feel as a Tyrolean, because that's where I spent my youth and my childhood. Our family background. Slightly intellectual middle class, I would say. My father started university studies, but couldn't finish it due to the World War II. My mother has something like, I don't know how you call it in English, it's first half of secondary education. Memories of childhood. Easy country life. So I grew up in a rather small place in the Tyrolean Alps. Skiing, playing football, enjoying nature, enjoying life, which I tried to continue for the rest of my life, of course. Yeah, that's about it. No particular memories of my childhood, actually. A lot of sports, not only skiing and football, track and fields and cross-country skiing, volleyball, and what the hell, boxing, judo, most everything. Then after finishing my school, I didn't really feel like doing anything serious. So I decided to become a sailor. Sailed around for a while, then came back, served at the army, and then finally it couldn't be avoided. I had to do something. So I started to study at Innsbruck University, linguistics and history. Got fed up with it very soon. And after 4 years, I was just ready to drop out. At that time, I learned about the new institute being established at Vienna University for Buddhist studies, and I thought that's a good chance. I'll go there, not to study, but just to be a listener, as a guest. So I came for 1 year, came for a second year, added a third year, and in this third year, Professor Steinkellner offered me a PhD topic, although I was not a serious student, but he obviously felt that way. So I was taken by surprise. I accepted this, and then I started to study it seriously. Yeah, that's about my story of becoming Tibetologist. Then, after finishing the PhD, I spent 1 year at the Drepung Monastery in South India to study Madhyamaka. This was actually my main field of research in the following years. It still is one of my main fields of interest, though not of studies anymore, which again is, coincidence. I like to travel very much. And so one day I had the chance to join art historic research project and fieldwork in India, in Sweden, particularly for Deprung Monastery, where I got in contact with the old manuscripts stored there. There are plenty of publications about it, so I will not talk about these things in particular. Then we decided, Professor Steinkeller decided actually, to start an own research project on these manuscripts. So I got involved in this, and this keeps me busy still. What else should I tell you? That's it.
Can I close the window a bit? Because
Yeah,
there's
sure,
this
sure.
water noise. Yeah,
Sure.
it will be nicer. Yeah, if it's okay. I mean,
No, that's
yeah, the
fine.
fountain is on only every second minute or something, right?
What?
The fountain, the water, keeps going like this only in breaks.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I close it?
Yeah,
Or do you
sure.
want to keep it a bit?
Sure. No, it's okay.
Okay, good. Could you tell me, Helmut, when you were a sailor, how old were you and where did you go? And how do you remember your travels at this time?
Well, it was just after finishing school, so I was 18. And I was sailing exclusively around Africa. How do I remember it? It was fantastic. It was the first time that I was away from home for a long time. And the first time I was really responsible for myself. So it's probably it was a process of growing up. And I saw some parts of the world. And for some time I considered of really becoming full-time sailor. I talked about this to one of my officers on the boat, and he said, "Don't be stupid. This is quite nice, sailing is quite nice when you're young, and there is an adventure in it. But after a couple of years, it's just a job, and you can work as well in the factory." So he said, "Go back, go to university, do something useful." And, I took his advice.
And why did you decide for sailing? And how does one become a sailor from Austria and from mountains? It's not a typical sailing country.
I don't say that. At that time, I think 70% of the sailors in the German merchant navy were either from Bavaria or from Austria. So sailor is is not a very highly esteemed job in northern Germany, and so boys from good families, they don't go to sea. And how did I decide? I was always fascinated by it from childhood on. I take the chance after finishing school. Hitchhiked to Hamburg, went to what they call Heuerstall. I wouldn't know any English name for that. Like where you find the jobs. Went there, and as I had no money, I had to take the first vessel they offered me, which was going down to Western Africa. That's it. Yeah.
So it was a trading vessel.
Yeah.
What were the commodities traded? Thank you. Something.
Cut.
Yeah, sure. Don't worry. And then, why did you become interested in Buddhism?
Maybe that's part of the personal development story. Like most of young people in the age between, let's say, 14 and 16 or something, they have something like a crisis. And in this phase, I tried to read all sorts of philosophy that I could get my hands on. And I also got in contact with Buddhism at that time, and I was fascinated by it.
What was the fascinating thing about it?
I guess what attracted me in the first place was the concept of being responsible for your liberation without depending on the grace of anybody or anything, which I always disliked in Christianity. I grew up as a Protestant. And in Protestantism, there is a much stronger stress on the grace of God than, let's say, in Catholicism. And I always disagreed with that. That God can decide whether I should be pious and have faith, and then I'll be liberated. If he doesn't like it, he will not do it. And I didn't like that concept. Maybe a theologian will not agree with my interpretation, but this is the way I felt at the time.
And what made you interested in Buddhist philosophy and Madhyamaka?
Madhyamaka. This is again a rather personal story. When I was a student in Innsbruck, I had, together with two friends, we played a rather stupid game. When we were sitting in this coffee house, we would listen to the conversation on the neighboring tables, and then at one point we would break into this discussion and just prove them wrong, which is an easy game, because usually in discussions people are not that logical, so you can always contradict them. And when I got in touch with this Madhyamaka system of Prasanga. Well, that's what I've been doing all the time. So I felt personally a strong relation to this methods of arguing. This was the beginning, of course, but later on I found that there is more to Madhyamaka than just Prasanga. But that was the beginning.
And when you came to the university to study unofficially, how did the classes look like? Who were your teachers? What did you do in the classes?
At that time, the institute was very small. And in fact, Professor Steinkellner was the only academic teacher. We also had a Tibetan teaching colloquial Tibetan, but the rest was covered all by Professor Steinkellner. And well, the classes were rather small. I can't remember any class with more than 4 students.
Did you read texts or what did you?
Yeah. I forgot that part of your question. Well, Steinkellner's philosophy at that time was to give rather few lectures. They were of a very general kind, introductory lectures, and all the more detailed information we should get from the texts themselves. So the main emphasis was actually on reading texts.
Do some of your classmates also, did they continue with this interest? Do we know them?
One of them you will meet tomorrow. But he's the only one who survived from that time.
And at that time, was it something unusual to study Buddhism and Sanskrit and Tibetan? What was it? How did your environment, how did they think about it?
Well, I think that hasn't changed very much in the public attitude. It's interesting but crazy, and I agree with them. It is crazy because it's nothing you can do for a living. Well, I could. I was lucky, but in general, you cannot expect to live on this. Well, one thing I should add, when I said Steinkellner did all the teaching, this was actually meant for the Tibetological part. Of course, it was always combined with Sanskrit and Indian philosophy, and of course there were other teachers in this field.
Like who?
Well, the head of the department at that time was Professor Oberhammer, and lecturers for Sanskrit. The Sanskrit introduction I had with Rock Miskita.
Good. And how do you remember these classes?
Oh, I have no particular memories of that. And other teachers from the Indological department that might be known more widely. Bettina Bäumer. For Uzbozeit, nobody will remember, I guess.
Was it also reading classes?
Yeah. Primarily.
And you said that there was a colloquial Tibetan taught as well.
Yeah.
Did you learn?
Being honest, no. I never really managed very much of colloquial Tibetan. It was not a major issue at that time. Well, I think at that point we have to look at the origin of Tibetan studies in Vienna. In the beginning, it was not really Tibetan studies. It was Buddhist studies. And the Tibetan language was just necessary as a source language. So in the very beginning, during the time of my studies and also the first years of my professional career, Tibetan was really an auxiliary to Buddhist studies. It only very slowly turned into an independent discipline. Of course, with the anthropologists coming in, the art historians coming in, so the interests became much wider. Tibetan studies as an independent discipline. I don't know, it's not that old. It's only a couple of decades.
Who was the teacher of colloquial Tibetan at the time?
His name was Lobsang Dargye. He also passed away several years ago. I do not really know how he came to Vienna. I think he was in Munich first, and somehow he got in touch with Stenkel and he brought him here.
How do you remember him as a person, as a teacher?
I really loved him. And he was a fantastic cook. So in joke we made plans that in case I will not succeed in the studies, we will open a restaurant together.
Did you do?
No, we didn't. Just joking like that.
You could have. And how did you come to study at Drepung, or in Deprung Monastery? How did it happen?
How did I come to Drepung? Yeah, there happened to be a guest from Drepung. And I discussed with him the possibilities of studying at the Tibetan monastery. And yeah, I don't remember his name, but he somehow arranged this.
What did you study there? With whom?
Madhyamaka. It was all on Madhyamaka. The name of my teacher was Keshe something. Yeah, it was a great time. I learned a lot at that time. Besides, it turned out to be very helpful in contact with Tibetans. Whenever I told them I studied Uma at Loseling, they were very impressed and much more helpful.
And how did you study there? In Tibetan? You were reading texts or you were debating?
I guess it was the traditional way of studying, except for the fact that I was the only student. So I had my private teacher and an interpreter, because the teacher spoke only in Tibetan. We did it, well, as I said, the traditional way. We're studying a particular text, the teacher would explain it.
How do you remember the monastery at that time? And when was it?
1983, 84. It was, of course, much smaller than it is now. Now it's a huge city. Have you ever been there? Now, the last time I visited it, which is also several years ago, the local Tibetans there would refer to the monastery as Singapore, just because of the skyline.
And you were probably the only foreigner there.
No, there were 2 or 3 others. They're not staying that long, but they're coming and going.
What did you like about being there?
Well, apart from getting the traditional education in Madhyamaka, it was, getting in touch with people. I'm trained as a philologist. We read in texts. Actually, we need not go out of the house at any time. Just sitting at the desk and reading this stuff, which is kind of anonymous. But during my stay in the monastery, I started to realize people behind all these texts. I guess this was one of my most important experiences at that time.
And did you continue to build on this experience in your future work?
How do you mean that?
That there are people behind texts, or that there are people working with the same texts that you are working with, or interpreting them?
Of course. I mean, once my attitude towards the texts has changed, then it was changed. So the text ceased to be just letters on paper, but they turned into some human something. And this, of course, remained the same in my later academic life.
Was this your first time in India and in a Tibetan environment?
It was my first time in Tibetan environment, not in India. I had visited India already in 1971, purely as a tourist. But maybe it also had some influence on my later life, I don't know. But the fantastic thing at that time was that I was traveling with a friend, but by car overland, which gave me an impression of all the world between Austria and India. And there is quite a lot of it. Nowadays, I get in the plane in Vienna, and 7 hours later, I step out of the plane in Delhi, and it's just like taking a train to Bregenz, or I don't know, maybe that's roughly the same time. Yeah. No, I wouldn't miss that experience.
And how do you remember your travels in the 70s? Where did you go and how was it?
Well, it was a big adventure. And nowadays, going to India is not a big deal. Everybody has been to India who has a slight interest in it. But at that time, it was really exceptional, particularly in the parts of Austria that I come from. There were only very, very few people that ever traveled to India. Besides driving the car all this distance is quite an adventure. Well, we are going down to Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, then into India, and up to Nepal, Kashmir. Yeah. Ladakh was not open at that time, so you couldn't travel to Ladakh. Yeah, and then on the way back, we went again, Pakistan, Afghanistan, but then from Kandahar again down to Pakistan, and taking the south route to Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey. That was great.
How long did you spend on the way?
3 months, 4 months, yeah, 3 months and something.
What were your favorite places?
Well, although India was the aim, my favorite country at that time actually was Afghanistan. I was really in love with Afghanistan. And it's the political development is such a shame. Yeah, I mean, within India, I don't know, I didn't have any favorites in India at that time.
And what did you like about Afghanistan?
The most striking experience when coming into Afghanistan was that now really the Orient had started. All the cities we visited previously, they in a way they tried to be Western and imitate Europe, America. But when coming into Herat, this was a total change. This was now the Orient. And the landscape is fantastic. People are nice. Yeah.
Was this your first time in Asia?
Yeah.
And did you interact with other foreigners on the way? There must have been some other people like you in the 70s.
Not too many. Of course, there are always a couple of people on the way, and you keep meeting them. But there were not too many, and we had no particular interest in meeting Europeans there.
And where did you go in India? Did you go to some Tibetan places?
No. At that time, I had no connection with Tibet whatsoever.
And with Buddhism, did you have?
With Buddhism, yes, in the way I told in the beginning, there was this superficial contact. After having read some books, popular books, and you get the impression that you know something about it.
Can I ask which books did you read?
I can't remember.
So when did you meet the first Tibetans? At which occasion?
The first Tibetan I met must have been Lobsang Dalgye, I think.
It must have been beautiful traveling like that at that time.
Oh yes, it was.
Would you have some significant experiences you would always remember? Coming to Afghanistan?
No. People keep asking me such questions, and I said, no. Actually, no real significant thing. The whole thing was significant, but I wouldn't think of any details. Except for, well, there are always little minor things, but they're like feelings. I cannot talk there about them. Just how the sun looks at sunset, and how the grass is swaying in the wind. No spectacular things.
And you mentioned you liked traveling. What did you like about it?
How can I know? Just seeing other parts of the world, meeting other people, seeing what life looks in other places.
And what did happen afterwards? So you were in Drepung, and then?
Well, then I returned here. Well, not exactly here. We were not in this building, but same institute. And I remained there for the rest of my academic life.
So you finished your PhD and then you were employed at the institute?
Immediately, yes. In this respect, I have been extremely lucky throughout my life. I never had to compete for a position. I didn't even have to apply for a position. I just got it.
And what did you do when you got employed? What kind of employment was it? Did you teach or what did you do?
My first employment I had actually already during my student times. Studentenassistent, we call this in German. Then after finishing the PhD, I immediately got the position as an assistant. Then I made the habilitation. And my position was changed into an assistant professor. So everything came to me. I didn't have to bother about anything.
And did you both teach and did research?
Yeah. Well, the usual way at Vienna University is there is 1/3 of your time is for teaching, 1/3 for research, and 1/3 for administration.
What did you teach?
I started with the introduction to classical Tibetan, and then step by step other things came. Again, in the tradition of teaching of this institute, it was primarily reading. And here it was primarily Madhyamaka, though not exclusively. I read also some historical texts, grammatical texts. They tried to cover a wider field, but the focus always remained on Madhyamaka.
Did you like teaching?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Teaching is very enjoyable in a small group of interested students. Like a seminar with 3 students can be fantastic. But this lecturing, I never liked too much. Standing in front of 50 people and holding a monologue for 1.5 hours. This is not quite interesting for me.
And what did you like about research?
Well, you could call it curiosity, just to find out something. And in particularly finding out how human mind is working. And I don't mean this in the sense of psychologist, but rather concentrating of the product of the human mind. But how this comes together, how things are connected with each other. I think this is fascinating.
Which aspects of Madhyamaka did you find particularly fascinating?
Madhyamaka in general. So it's, we have already talked about the Prasanga method of arguing. But it also this concept of the different grades or steps of reality. This is a very fantastic idea. I really believe in that. I'm not a believing Buddhist, but this concept of Madhyamaka, that I would sign that.
Did you have some students who you consider particularly important, who might be continuing in your work?
My students that are important. I should look into the camera. It's a question what you consider your student. There are several students who had this introductory course of Tibetan with me, who are now renowned scholars themselves, like Christian Lutzanitz or Hildegard Dimberger, Shiki Koba. But in the case of really my students, that I say, I was leading them from beginning to end. Actually, there is nobody. But those who had a PhD with me, well, I would say the most important would be Markus Fiebeck, who is now again working with me in a research project.
You've been involved in many research projects. How did you choose the research topics, or what did you find the interesting topics? How did you get to the topics you worked on? You worked on history, philosophy, of course, but also development of Tibetan literature. How did you came to these interests?
I don't know. Well, the main topic of my research project was always the manuscripts, which started off as manuscripts in general and then specialized automatically on canonical literature, because it's just the majority of manuscripts you find are canonical stuff. And this, I think I mentioned this before, this came by coincidence, as seeing this manuscript piles at Drepung Monastery. And yeah, then I got fascinated by it, and not just tracing lines of transmission and tracing dependencies between various lines of transmission. This is, I think it is very fascinating. I don't know whether it helps anybody, but it's fascinating.
And why is it fascinating?
I don't know. It's fascinating for me. It might be extremely boring for somebody else. But it's just this, as I said before, it's tracing dependencies, tracing relations.
Do you have a special connection to Western Tibet? You've worked mostly on Western Tibet and material coming from there.
Yeah.
How did this happen?
This is a political issue. It is easy to go to the Indian part of the Tibetan cultural sphere. It is very difficult to get the Chinese part. And in addition to work there. So it just happened to be like this because it's accessible. Besides, I found out that it's not really a disadvantage, because just with regard to the canonical collections, apparently we have a very rich tradition in the Western part, and quite distinct from the Central and Eastern development. So I do not have the feeling I am missing something, concentrating to the Western parts.
You've traveled a lot in Western Tibet. What do you like about the place there, the culture there? What do you like about being there?
It's again, it's on the one hand, it's traveling, being away from home, being in a different environment, different cultural situation. Besides, the landscape is fantastic. I have a liking for three kind of landscapes, if you in a very broad sense. One is the mountains, one is the deserts, and one is the sea. in a way, they are all three are very similar. And, they're all basically deserts. And don't ask me why I'm attracted by that. I don't know. I just think it's fantastic. And here in the Western Himalaya, you have basically a combination of two of them. It's high mountains and it's desert. It's no sea, of course, but
Lakes?
there are lakes, yeah.
You said that you had a story from your travels about smoking saving your life. That was in Western Tibet.
This was in Western Tibet, yeah. I told this story many times, in particularly in the argumentation of on smoking. I was going up to Kinor in a van. And then one spot, there were some rocks lying in the street, and the driver got out to put these rocks away. And then we started again. And just when the driver started, he realized that the cigarettes, which lay in the front, they had slipped to the far end. So he stopped to take his cigarettes. And at the same moment, a landslide came down 10 meters in front of our cars. It was a huge landslide. There were big rocks and tons of rocks. So if he had been a non-smoker, we would have been under this landslide.
Helmut, could you please say something about the Csoma de Kőrös symposiums?
Well, I guess I need not talk about Csoma de Kőrös. It's generally known who he is. In the 80s, mid-80s, they started the tradition of the Csoma de Kőrös Memorial Symposiums in Hungary. If I remember right, the first was in 76, if I remember right. Held at Madhyamaka in Hungary. Then it was followed by another one, also in Hungary, at Drepung in 1978. Yeah, in the beginning it was the theory to have it every second year, but the tradition didn't last very long. If my memory doesn't fail me, there were only 4 such conferences, with the third one being organized in Austria by organized by our institute. Then there was another one again in Hungary, and now rather recently they tried to somehow revive the tradition, and they had the following symposium held at Delhi in, now let me think for a minute, 2014, 2013, 2014, something around that time. But that was actually then the end, because the role of this symposia was totally taken over by the IELTS.
And you organized one of the symposiums in Vienna.
Yeah, in 1980.
One.
81?
81?
81.
The proceedings were 81, sorry.
No, you are perfectly right. No, you're not.
I'm not.
I think it was 80. Because I had just finished my PhD. It was just very shortly after finishing the PhD. So it must have been in 1980.
And how do you remember the meeting? Who were the people who came? Was it Tibetan Studies, or who was involved? What was the group of people?
Yeah, it were all Tibetologists, of course, and it was a rather small conference. So we thought it was big. Must have been around 80 people or so. Who was there? I really can't remember all of them. Sifa Ruik was there. Then there was what was quite sensational at that time was we had a scholar from China, Wang Yao. Who else do I remember? Gesabet Limfari, of course, was there. I don't remember all of them, but
80 people is a lot.
it was a lot at that time. Of course, you can't compare it to the IELTS meetings of these days.
And what was the atmosphere of this meeting?
Relaxed and rather family-like atmosphere.
And did you know some of the people from your travels in Asia? And how did you collect these people? You sent them letters. You would know about them somehow from the previous symposiums or through friends, even about their existence.
Well, I was very young in the field at that time. I had just finished my PhD, and of course I knew some of the people from their publications. Not all of them, though. No, this was all done by Steinkel. He will tell you more about that.
Was there a significant number of people working on philosophy? What was the profile of the people from which disciplines they came, or which methodologies? Were there any anthropologists at the time, or was it philologists?
It was pretty much everything. Philosophy, it was, if I remember these things correctly, there was a substantial part of it was on philosophy. I would say in percentage much more than it is the case now at these big conferences.
And were there people only from Europe, apart from the Chinese scholar?
No, there were Americans, of course. Did we have any Asian participants, except for Wang Yao from China? I can't remember.
You mentioned your PhD. Could you say more about it?
Oh, there's much to be said about it. My PhD was the translation of a part of the 6th chapter of Madhyamaka by Chandrakirti. It's the beginning of this chapter had already been translated by Lavallée Poussin. But the rest of the chapter I took up just to complete this philosophical part of the Madhyamaka.
And why did you decide for this text?
I didn't decide. A professor decided for me. I've never told him, but I can say this now. It was the perfect choice that he took for me.
So why was it perfect choice in the end?
Because I liked it.
Great. Helmut, could you say something more about Tibetan studies or studies related to Tibet in different ways in Vienna? It's quite interesting to see that most people in Tibetan studies, if we call it that way, or Buddhist studies, working with Tibetan material, they focus on philosophy.
Well, this is founded in the tradition of this Viennese institute. Now I must go one step back. Of course, there have been Tibet-related studies in Vienna before the foundation of this institute, like Bleichsteiner, Lebesky, Wojkowicz, well-known people. But within this institute, the Tibetan studies were initiated by Frau Wallner. He was interested in philosophy and he worked on philosophy. Steinkeldner, who actually founded this Institute for Tibetan Studies, is a student of Frau Wallner, and he was working very much in the tradition of Frau Wallner. And the next generation, this is me and the colleagues, of course, we also followed this tradition. And to some extent, it's still kept up. Not in the same form, but still we have a focus on philology in on one land, which is not so self-evident in Tibetan studies these days. And we also have a strong emphasis on philosophy, though it's not exclusively philosophy. It's also the range of studies and also of work done here is now reaching a more broader field.
Have you seen some changes or developments in studying Tibetan or Buddhist philosophy throughout your career?
Worldwide. Well, in general, I would say the emphasis on philosophy as such is decreasing. There are a few colleagues, international colleagues, who are still devoted to these studies. There are a few very excellent scholars, but on a general level, I think the interest is shifting on the one hand on religious questions, on the other hand on anthropological topics. The way I see it, they are now taking over the majority of the Tibetan studies.
Do you have any explanations? Why is it so?
No. Well, increasing interest in religious topics, of course, is connected to the increasing acknowledgement of Buddhism as a religion worldwide. Why there is less interest in philosophy, I couldn't say.
And could you say more something about the origin of this department? It's called Tibetan and Buddhist Studies, South Asian Studies.
Yeah. Well, the before mentioned Frau Wallner, he was professor of the Department of Indology. But he started working with the Tibetan material. His student, Steinkellner, concentrated even more on Tibetan material, though it was Buddhist studies primarily, and the other aspects of Tibetan studies were just taking account of marginally, actually, like history and literature and things like that. Then there might have been personal reasons involved. Steinkellner will tell you more about that. He started an institute of his own, which was then parted from the Indological Institute. Of course, this separation of the two institutes had its particularly history, but from the point of view of the field itself, it's not really logical. In the way the studies are done in this institute, they actually belong together. So then, after several years of separation, it was then decided to join again. And at that time, the Indologist felt that Indology is not the adequate term, particularly in the eyes of the Indians themselves, because it's not only India that is concerned with it. So it was decided to rename it more politically correct South Asian Studies. This was rejoined in, I don't know, Stadtfeld never know. Yeah, and ever since then we have this very long title of the department, which is not very handy when you're writing address.
You were the director of the department at some point.
Yes, for 1 year only. I don't know why. Apparently nobody else wanted to do it, so I was it for 1 year. Fortunately, it didn't last long. I really never had the intention of being the head of the department.
And would you have something to say on the development of the department in terms of a study focus? I mean, topics studied or languages studied or maybe disciplines or sub-disciplines. There's also medical anthropology included now.
A little bit. Because there is the Department of Anthropology and this university, so it's now this I think is connected with the development in the South Asian part of the department. When there was introduced a section of modern South Asian studies that are per se much more anthropology lasting. Within the Tibetan part, no, I don't think that there is much emphasis on anthropology. It all goes within the framework of modern South Asian studies. And in the section of Tibetan and Buddhist studies, I think the emphasis on the topic is not very much changed. Of course, these things always change with the interests of the shareholder. So while at Steinkellner's times there was a strong emphasis on the Brahmana studies, now with Mathis it shifts over to Shentong, Mahamudra, and these things. But still, students are free to choose other topics if they want. It's just a question: is there somebody who might help with their work? Such things happened also in the old days. I remember there was one student who was particularly interested in grammar. and because nobody here would supervise a PhD on Tibetan grammar. So a supervisor from outside was organized for him. So this is always possible.
Do you see some overall changes in Tibetan and Buddhist studies in general? Not only in Vienna, but as a whole?
Of course, everything is changing all the time. Well, maybe we have to distinct America and Europe, as the approach in America had always been very strongly influenced by the actual practice of Buddhism, which is not the case in Europe. Though this might change, this might increase in Europe and maybe decrease in America. Otherwise, the changes in international Tibetan studies, the whole Tibetan studies is a story of change. Because as an independent discipline, it's only been developing during the last few decades. So everything is a change. And then also within Tibetan studies, new disciplines come up. It's getting much more differentiated. Like what I'm engaged in presently, conjure studies. Well, this came up like 20 years ago or so. And so the whole thing keeps moving.
Tibetan studies in Vienna are a very successful field within the university. They get funding, they employ many people. Would you have an explanation for this? It's a very lively department. It's quite unusual for Tibetan studies to have such a good grounding somewhere.
Well, it's a small department. Lively, yes. This might be. It's I really can't answer this question. I would feel tempted to say it's because it's run by people who have a strong interest in it. But this, of course, is the case in other places as well. And, I don't know too many departments from personal experience that I could say whether this year is really exceptional. But for several years we had the lucky constellation that we had colleagues from various fields, but interested in Tibetan studies, working at the same time here in Vienna, and also collaborate. So this might be one of the strong points here, that we for a certain period we had really a concentration of various interests related to Tibet. It's not so much the case anymore, because art history, which was very strongly dominated by the Tibetan, well, not art history in general, what we call non-European art history, was dominated by Tibet for many years, and this is now shifting into other directions. So I have the feeling Vienna is losing this position as a center. But we are very, very well linked internationally. It still goes on to some extent.
Is there general knowledge about Tibet in Austria among normal people?
Not much. Of course, everybody knows the Dalai Lama, in particular since he was awarded the Nobel Prize. And you will find once in a while in the crossword puzzles in the newspapers, capital of Tibet or Dalai Lama's palace and such things. So it's some people have heard about Tibet. No, this is now not really true. Most of the people have heard about Tibet. Still, it comes up in the news once in a while. But the general knowledge is not very profound, let's say.
Helmut, as you worked on philosophy, do you have a favorite philosopher?
Buddhist or?
Either. Or both.
Well, within the Buddhist philosophy, it's naturally within the Madhyamaka field. Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, like other philosophers. I like Krishnamurti. From the European philosophers, Wittgenstein, yes, from the more modern ones, from the antiques. Aristotle, of course, is influencing all our way of life up to these days. And, no, but I wouldn't have any particularly favorite philosopher.
And which philosophers you like to read in Tibetan?
Again, it's the Uma tradition. In recent times, I got particularly interested in the early Tibetan, the Kadampa authors, which I find very, very interesting. Jawachiki Senge or Shantakpa. I think they are very interesting guys.
What has your career given to you personally, or how has it changed your life?
Well, it has supported all of my life. Though I had various jobs during my young days, my only real serious employment was at the university. Did it change my life? It influenced my life, of course, and as such, it necessarily also had some changes. But I could not give you any drastic examples. Of course, when you engage in Buddhist philosophy for the greater part of your life, necessarily it will have some influences on you. Because I can hardly imagine that you can spend 40 years working on a philosophy that you absolutely dislike. Maybe it's possible, but I couldn't do it. So quite obviously there are some aspects I took over in my personal view on the world. Though I'm not a Buddhist, still there are some aspects that definitely had an impact.
And what did you find most interesting and most challenging during your work?
Everything.
Both.
Well, if we leave aside all the administration part of university life, I think it is in itself, it's challenging and it's interesting. No, I wouldn't add anything to that.
What do you see as your most significant academic contributions and why?
This is for somebody else to decide. I don't know whether I made any significant contribution to the field. It's of course what we are building right up now in our research project and the Conjure studies. This I consider quite important, but this is not my contribution. This is the contribution of the whole team. But yeah, as I said, somebody else in the next generation maybe should answer this question.
Are there still topics you would like to pursue?
I will certainly not take up any new topics anymore. Probably I'm too old for that. But within these two parts of my research interest, which is Tibetan Madhyamaka and the Kancha development, there is so much left to be done. And I have started several works which I have to continue. And, this is enough for the rest of my life, I would say.
And as you know, we are conducting this project for contemporary and future generations of students, researchers, and people interested in Tibet. Somehow, would you have a message for them?
Try to find a decent job. But if you're crazy enough to go on with Tibetan studies, then go on.
Thank you, Helmut. It was nice talking to you.
Welcome.
Yeah, good luck with the kanjur. It must be huge work.
Yeah.